The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Catherine pulled her silk robe tighter around her shoulders. Through the tall windows of their private quarters, she could see the ancient oak trees swaying gently in the October breeze. The golden leaves danced in the pale sunlight, creating patterns on the stone courtyard below. It was the kind of morning that usually filled her with peace, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of an inevitable goodbye. William stood at his desk, papers scattered before him like fallen autumn leaves. His usually perfect posture seemed slightly bent under an invisible burden. The official documents bore the royal seal, each one marking another step toward what they both knew was coming. He had been staring at the same page for 20 minutes, his blue eyes fixed on words that seemed to blur together. The children's laughter echoed from the garden below, where George, Charlotte, and Louis played their morning game of hide and seek among the hedgerows. Their nanny, Maria, watched carefully from a respectful distance, her weathered hands clasped behind her back. She had served the family for 7 years now, and had learned to read the subtle signs of tension that occasionally rippled through the household. Catherine walked slowly across the Persian carpet, her bare feet silent on the ancient floor. She paused behind William's chair, her hand hovering just above his shoulder. The space between her palm and his shirt seemed to hold all the words they had been unable to say for weeks. Finally, she let her hand settle gently on the fabric, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath. "The Commonwealth tour announcement will be made this afternoon," William said quietly, his voice carrying the formal tone he used when discussing official duties. But Catherine heard the underlying tremor, the slight catch that only she would notice after 15 years together. She moved to the window, watching their children play. George, now 11, was teaching his younger siblings a complicated game that seemed to involve a great deal of running and dramatic falling onto the grass. Charlotte, 9 years old and fierce as her great-grandmother had been, was clearly winning whatever competition they had invented. Little Louis, only 6, stumbled after his older siblings with determined giggles. 6 months, Catherine whispered, more to herself than to William. 6 months touring Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and 12 other Commonwealth nations. 6 months of royal duties, state dinners, and carefully choreographed public appearances. 6 months away from the children, from each other in any meaningful way, from the quiet moments that made their unusual life bearable. William set down his pen and turned his chair to face her. The morning light caught the silver threads that had appeared as brown hair over the past few years, a reminder that they were no longer the young couple who had captured the world's imagination on their wedding day. They were approaching 40 now, settled into their roles as the future king and queen of England, but still learning to navigate the impossible balance between duty and family. "The Foreign Office believes it's necessary," he continued, his diplomatic training evident in every measured word. "The Republican movements in several Commonwealth nations have been gaining ground. They need to see us as a family, as real people who care about their countries and their futures." Catherine nodded, understanding the political realities even as her heart rebelled against them. She had grown up watching William struggle with the weight of his future crown, had seen how the constant public scrutiny had shaped him into someone who could smile warmly for cameras while feeling deeply isolated inside. She had promised herself on their wedding day that she would be his shelter from that storm, the place where he could simply be William instead of the future king. "And the children's schooling?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Royal protocol, security concerns, and educational stability all pointed to the same conclusion. The children would remain at Lambrook School, living primarily with their nanny and grandparents during the week, seeing their parents only through video calls and carefully scheduled brief returns. "Grandmother has agreed to increase her presence at Windsor," William said, referring to the Queen Consort, who had become unexpectedly close to the children over the years. "And your parents have offered to adjust their schedules to provide more consistency." The practical arrangements have been discussed and rediscussed in countless meetings with private secretaries, security officials, and family members. Everyone agreed that the children's routine should be disrupted as little as possible. Everyone agreed that this tour was crucial for the monarchy's future. Everyone agreed that William and Catherine were the perfect ambassadors to strengthen the Commonwealth bonds. What no one could quantify was the cost of 6 months of separation on a family that had worked so hard to remain close despite the extraordinary pressures of royal life. A gentle knock interrupted their conversation. "Your Royal Highnesses," came the familiar voice of their private secretary, James Harrison. "The morning briefing materials have arrived, and the Prime Minister's office has requested a call at 11. "Thank you, James," William replied, slipping seamlessly back into his official role. "Please arrange the call in the blue drawing room, and ask them to prepare the Commonwealth tour files for our review." Catherine watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and sadness. William's ability to compartmentalize his emotions and focus on duty had served him well throughout his life, but she sometimes worried about the parts of himself he locked away in order to function in his role. After James withdrew, silence settled over the room again. Outside, the children had moved their game to the rose garden, their voices growing more distant. The ancient walls of Windsor seemed to absorb sound and emotion equally, creating a space where even the most profound conversations felt muffled by history. "Do you remember our first Commonwealth tour?" Catherine asked, settling into the cream-colored armchair beside William's desk. "We were so nervous about saying the wrong thing, about making some cultural misstep that would end up on the front page of every newspaper in London." William's expression softened slightly at the memory. "You wore that blue dress in Tuvalu, and the Prime Minister's wife told you that you looked like a princess from a fairy tale. You blushed so deeply that I thought you might faint." "I was terrified," Catherine admitted. "Everyone kept telling me how natural you were at royal duties, how you had been born for this life. But they watched my every move, waiting for me to prove I didn't belong." Those early tours had been a trial by fire for Catherine, who had grown up in a comfortable but ordinary middle-class family. She had learned to navigate the complex protocols of royal engagements, the art of meaningful small talk with complete strangers, the skill of remaining gracious and interested even when exhausted or overwhelmed. But more than that, she had learned to be William's partner in the truest sense, supporting him while finding her own authentic voice within the confines of royal tradition. "This tour will be different," William said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "We know what we're doing now. We understand how to connect with people while fulfilling our obligations to the crown." Catherine studied his profile as he gazed out the window. Even after all these years, she could see glimpses of the university student she had fallen in love with, the young man who had struggled with the burden of his heritage while trying to forge his own identity. The weight of kingship had always been his inheritance, but becoming a father had added new layers of complexity to that burden. "The children understand," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely certain this was true. They had explained the tour in age-appropriate terms, emphasizing the important work they would be doing and the exciting places they would visit. But George, in particular, had grown quieter in recent weeks, as if sensing the undercurrents of tension between his parents. "George asked me last night if we were getting divorced," William said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. He said his friend Henry's parents went on separate long trips before they announced their separation. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. They had been so careful to present a united front, to discuss the tour as a positive opportunity rather than a necessary sacrifice. But children, especially perceptive children like George, had a way of sensing emotional truths that adults try to hide. "What did you tell him?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I told him that sometimes people who love each other very much have to do difficult things for important reasons," William replied. "I told him that our love for each other and for our family was stronger than any distance or time apart." The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a hope wrapped in parental reassurance. Catherine wanted to believe them completely, to trust that their marriage was strong enough to withstand 6 months of separation and the intense scrutiny that would accompany every moment of the tour. But she had seen too many royal marriages crumble under similar pressures, had witnessed how duty and distance could erode even the strongest emotional bonds. "He's worried about you," William continued. "He said you've been sad lately, even when you're smiling." Catherine turned away, embarrassed by how transparent her emotions had apparently become. She prided herself on her composure, on her ability to maintain the serene public face that royal protocol demanded. If 11-year-old George could see through that facade, she wondered what the press and public might be observing. "I don't want him to carry our burdens," she said firmly. "None of them should have to worry about adult problems." "They're royal children," William replied with a touch of sadness. "They'll carry these burdens their entire lives, whether we want them to or not." The truth of this statement settled over them like a familiar weight. They had both hoped to give their children a more normal childhood than William had experienced, but the realities of royal life made complete normalcy impossible. The children would grow up understanding that their personal happiness would always be secondary to their duty to the crown and the people they served. A commotion from the garden drew their attention back to the window. Louis had apparently fallen and scraped his knee, and Charlotte was attempting to comfort him while George ran toward the castle, presumably to fetch help. Catherine's maternal instincts kicked in immediately, and she started toward the door. "Maria will handle it," William said gently, catching her arm. "They need to learn that we won't always be here to solve their problems." The casual cruelty of this necessity struck Catherine anew. Their children would indeed need to learn independence earlier than most, would need to understand that their parents' availability was subject to the demands of duty and service. It was a lesson that William had learned too young and too harshly, and one that Catherine had hoped to soften for their own children. Through the window, they watched Maria efficiently clean Louis's scrape and apply a bandage while the other children offered sympathy and distraction. The crisis passed quickly, as childhood crises usually do, but Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that it was a preview of larger separations to come. "I keep thinking about your mother," Catherine said suddenly, "about how she tried to balance being a royal with being a mother, and how impossible that balance became." William's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Diana. His mother's struggles with royal protocol and media attention had been well documented, but her fierce devotion to her sons had been equally evident. Diana had tried to give William and Harry as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of royal life, but the cost to her own emotional well-being had been enormous. "She would understand," William said finally. "She would understand the choice we're making, even if she wouldn't necessarily approve of it." Catherine wasn't entirely convinced. Diana had been famously protective of her time with William, and Harry had fought against royal traditions that would have separated her from her children for extended periods. But Diana had also been younger, less experienced in royal protocol, and ultimately less successful in balancing her personal and public roles. "The tour route has been finalized," William said, returning to practical matters. "We'll begin in Australia, spend 3 weeks covering the major cities and rural areas, then move to New Zealand for 10 days. Canada will be the longest segment, nearly 2 months covering all the provinces and territories. The Caribbean islands, South Africa, and the Pacific nations will complete the itinerary." Catherine had studied the proposed schedule until she could recite it from memory. Every day was packed with official engagements, cultural events, and carefully orchestrated opportunities to demonstrate the royal family's continued relevance to Commonwealth nations. There would be hospital visits, university ceremonies, agricultural tours, and state dinners. They would meet with governors general, prime ministers, and local leaders. They would be photographed, interviewed, and analyzed by media outlets around the world. "The press will be watching for any signs of strain between us," she said, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her for weeks. "They'll be looking for evidence that the separation is affecting our marriage. Then we'll have to be very careful to disappoint them," William replied with a slight smile. We've had years of practice at presenting a united front for public consumption. This was true, but Catherine worried about the emotional toll of maintaining that facade for 6 months under intense international scrutiny. They had learned to navigate British media attention, but the Commonwealth tour would expose them to journalists and photographers from dozens of countries, many with their own perspectives on the British monarchy's role in their nation's futures. I've been reading about the Republican movements, Catherine continued. Some of the criticism is quite pointed. They question whether the monarchy is relevant to modern Commonwealth nations, whether our visits are meaningful or just expensive pageantry. William nodded grimly. The Republican sentiment had been growing in several Commonwealth nations, particularly among younger populations who saw the British monarchy as an outdated colonial remnant. The tour was designed, in part, to demonstrate that William and Catherine represented a modern, engaged royal family that understood and respected the diverse cultures of the Commonwealth. "We'll need to be authentic," William said. "People can sense when we're just going through the motions. They need to see that we genuinely care about their countries and their futures." Authenticity, Catherine reflected, was perhaps their greatest challenge. How could they be genuine while following carefully scripted protocols? How could they form real connections with people they met briefly in highly artificial settings? How could they represent British interests while respecting the sovereignty and unique identities of the nations they visited? The morning briefing materials that James had mentioned lay stacked on William's desk, thick folders containing background information on every location they would visit, every official they would meet, every cultural tradition they needed to understand and respect. Catherine had spent countless hours studying similar materials for previous tours, memorizing names and faces and conversation topics that would help her connect with the people she encountered. "Mrs. Patterson wants to schedule additional etiquette briefings," Williams said, referring to their longtime protocol advisor. "Apparently, there have been some changes in diplomatic customs since our last major tour." Catherine suppressed a sigh. The etiquette briefings were necessary, but tedious, covering everything from proper greeting customs to gift-giving protocols to appropriate conversation topics for different cultural contexts. She had learned over the years that even well-intentioned gestures could be misinterpreted if they violated local customs or traditions. "And the security briefings?" she asked, though she knew this would be another source of concern. International tours always involved complex security arrangements, but the current global political climate had made royal travel increasingly complicated and expensive. 2 sessions next week, William confirmed. They're particularly concerned about the South Pacific segments. Some of the smaller nations have limited security infrastructure, and there have been recent incidents of political unrest. The security concerns added another layer of stress to an already challenging undertaking. Catherine had learned to accept the constant presence of protection officers and the elaborate precautions that surrounded every public appearance, but she never became completely comfortable with the implicit acknowledgement that their lives might be in danger simply because of who they were. A soft chime from the grandfather clock in the corner reminded them that the morning was advancing, and soon their private time would be consumed by the endless meetings and obligations that filled their official schedules. Catherine treasured these quiet moments in their quarters, when they could speak freely without considering how their words might be interpreted or reported. "I should check on the children," she said, rising from her chair. "Louis will want to show me his bandage, and Charlotte probably has strong opinions about how Maria handled the medical emergency." William smiled at this observation. Charlotte had indeed inherited strong opinions and the confidence to express them, qualities that would serve her well in royal life, but sometimes made parenting more challenging. At 9 years old, she already showed signs of the fierce independence that had characterized several generations of royal women. "I'll join you in a moment," William said, turning back to his papers. "I need to review these trade agreement summaries before the Prime Minister's call." Catherine paused at the door, looking back at her husband as he bent over his work. In the morning light, with his hair slightly mussed from their early conversation, he looked more like the university student she had fallen in love with in the future King of England. But The weight of his responsibilities was evident in the set of his shoulders, in the careful concentration he brought to every document and decision. "William," she said softly, and he looked up from his reading. "Whatever happens during these 6 months, whatever challenges we face or mistakes we make, we'll face them together, even when we're apart." His expression softened, and for a moment the formal mask of royal duty slipped away entirely. "I love you," he said simply, words that had sustained them through 15 years of marriage and would need to sustain them through the months ahead. "I love you too," she replied, meaning it completely despite all her fears and reservations about their upcoming separation. Outside, the children's voices had grown louder again as they invented a new game that seemed to involve a great deal of theatrical arguing. Catherine could distinguish George's patient explanations, Charlotte's dramatic protests, and Louis's delighted giggles. Soon enough, these sounds would be replaced by the formal quiet of official residences and hotel suites around the world, punctuated only by scheduled video calls and carefully timed phone conversations. But for now, on this October morning at Windsor Castle, they were still a family living under the same roof, sharing meals and bedtime stories and the ordinary moments that made their extraordinary life feel almost normal. Catherine held on to this feeling as she left the room, knowing that she would need to remember it during the long months ahead. The autumn air carried a crisp promise of winter as Catherine walked through the gardens of Windsor Castle, her footsteps muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves that covered the ancient pathways. 3 weeks had passed since the Commonwealth tour announcement, and the reality of their upcoming departure was becoming more tangible with each passing day. The children had adjusted to the news with the resilience that seemed to come naturally to royal children, but Catherine could see the questions in their eyes during quiet moments. Louis ran ahead of her along the rose walk, his small legs pumping with determination as he chased a butterfly that seemed to dance just beyond his reach. At 6 years old, he possessed an infectious optimism that made even the most solemn royal engagements feel lighter. His laughter echoed off the stone walls of the castle, a sound that Catherine found herself memorizing for the months when she would only hear it through video calls. "Mummy, look," Charlotte called from her position near the fountain, where she had apparently discovered something fascinating among the fallen leaves. At 9, she had developed an intense curiosity about the natural world that often surprised and delighted her tutors. Her governess, Miss Andrews, encouraged these interests while gently steering Charlotte toward the more traditional subjects expected of a future princess. George stood beside the ancient oak tree that had been his favorite climbing spot since he was Louis's age, but today he seemed more interested in observing his younger siblings than joining their games. At 11, he was beginning to understand the weight of his own future responsibilities, and Catherine sometimes caught glimpses of his grandfather's serious demeanor in the boy's thoughtful expressions. "What has Charlotte discovered this time?" Catherine asked as she approached George, ruffling his sandy hair with the casual affection that was still possible in these private family moments. "Some kind of beetle," George replied, his voice carrying the slightly exasperated tone of an older brother who had seen many enthusiastic scientific discoveries. "She's convinced it's a rare species that deserves immediate protection and possibly its own nature preserve." Catherine smiled at this assessment, which was probably quite accurate. Charlotte's passionate advocacy for various causes had already become legendary among the castle staff, who had learned to take her environmental and social justice concerns seriously while gently redirecting her more ambitious reform proposals. "Your father and I wanted to speak with all 3 of you about the tour," Catherine said, settling onto the stone bench that had been placed beneath the oak tree generations ago. "There are some things we need to discuss before we finalize the arrangements." George's expression grew more serious, and he moved closer to the bench. Charlotte, hearing the formal tone in her mother's voice, abandoned her beetle observation and approached with Louis trailing behind her, his butterfly chase temporarily forgotten. "Are you definitely going for 6 months?" Charlotte asked directly, her green eyes reflecting the same intensity she brought to all her inquiries. "James Morrison's parents went to Singapore for 3 months last year, and he said it felt like forever. "Yes, darling," Catherine confirmed gently. "6 months is a long time, and we wanted to make sure you understand what that means for our family." Louis, who had been only vaguely aware of the tour's implications, suddenly looked uncertain. "Will you miss Christmas?" he asked, his small voice carrying a tremor that made Catherine's heart ache. "We'll be home for Christmas." William's voice came from behind them as he approached across the lawn, having finished his morning meetings earlier than expected. "That was one of our non-negotiable requirements when we planned the schedule." He settled onto the bench beside Catherine, and she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as his presence completed their family circle. Despite all the pressures of their public roles, moments like these reminded her why they had chosen to build a life together within the impossible constraints of royal duty. "But we'll miss Halloween," Charlotte observed with the practical assessment that characterized her approach to most problems. "And Guy Fawkes night, and probably lots of school events." "That's true," William acknowledged, refusing to minimize the sacrifices their departure would require. "We'll miss some important family moments, and that makes us sad too. But sometimes being part of this family means making difficult choices for important reasons." George, who had been listening intently, spoke up with surprising maturity. "Is it because people in those countries are thinking about not wanting the Queen anymore?" Catherine and William exchanged a quick glance, surprised by their son's sophisticated understanding of the political motivations behind the tour. They had tried to present the trip in terms of positive diplomatic opportunities rather than defensive responses to Republican movements. "Partly," William admitted, choosing honesty over diplomatic evasion. "Some people in Commonwealth countries question whether the monarchy is still relevant to their lives. Our job is to show them that we care about their countries and want to support their success and independence." "But why do you have to be the ones to go?" Louis asked, his 6-year-old logic seeking a simpler solution. "Can't someone else tell them we're nice?" William smiled at his youngest son's question, recognizing the essential challenge of royal representation. "Sometimes people need to meet us in person to understand who we really are," he explained. "When we visit their countries, attend their celebrations, and learn about their cultures, it shows respect and genuine interest." Charlotte, ever practical, had moved on to more immediate concerns. "Who will help with my science project on renewable energy sources?" Mrs. Patterson said she doesn't know anything about solar panels. "Grandfather Charles is quite knowledgeable about renewable energy," Catherine suggested, referring to the king, whose environmental advocacy had become one of his defining characteristics. "And your teacher, Miss Andrews, has arranged for video conferences with experts who can guide your research." The mention of their grandfather seemed to reassure the children somewhat. King Charles had always been an engaged grandparent, despite his busy schedule, and his genuine delight in his grandchildren's interests and achievements had created strong bonds with all 3 children. "Will you call us every day?" George asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who was trying to manage his own emotions while setting an example for his younger siblings. "Every single day," Catherine promised, though she knew that time zones and official schedules would sometimes make this challenging. "We'll video call for bedtime stories when possible, and we'll send pictures and messages throughout our days." "And we'll send you pictures too," Charlotte announced, apparently warming to the idea of maintaining long-distance communication. "I can document any new beetles I discover, and Louis can show you his drawings, and George can update you on his football matches." The mention of George's football brought another wave of sadness to Catherine's heart. She had rarely missed his matches, had become one of those parents who cheered perhaps too enthusiastically from the sidelines while trying to maintain appropriate royal dignity. The other parents had grown accustomed to her presence, and she valued the glimpses of normal parenting that these school events provided. Speaking of football, William said, "Coach Henderson wants to schedule some additional practices before we leave. He thinks the team has a real chance at the regional championship this year." George's face brightened at this news, though Catherine noticed he didn't express the uncomplicated excitement he might have shown a few months ago. The approaching separation was affecting all of them, adding undertones of sadness to moments that should have been purely joyful. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that you'll be staying at some very interesting places, Catherine continued, steering the conversation toward the positive aspects of the children remaining at Windsor. The Queen Consort has invited you to spend weekends at Clarence House, and Granny and Grandpa Middleton have planned some special outings in Berkshire. The children's maternal grandparents, Michael and Carol Middleton, have been incredibly supportive throughout Catherine's adjustment to royal life. Their comfortable, unpretentious home in Berkshire provided a retreat where the children could experience something approaching normal family life, complete with homemade biscuits and garden games that had no protocols or security considerations. Will there be photographers following you everywhere? Charlotte asked, her question reflecting the growing awareness all royal children developed about media attention. Miss Andrews showed us some pictures from her last tour, and there were crowds of people everywhere. There will be lots of photographers, William confirmed, and crowds of people who are excited to meet us. But we've learned how to focus on the people we're talking with rather than the cameras around us. This was a skill that had taken both William and Catherine years to develop. Early in their marriage, the constant presence of photographers had been overwhelming and intrusive, making genuine connections with the public feel artificial and staged. They had learned to create small bubbles of authentic interaction within the larger spectacle of royal visits. I saw a news program that said some people don't want you to visit, George said quietly, his statement hanging in the air like a challenge to the cheerful tone they had been trying to maintain. Catherine felt her stomach tighten at this revelation. They had tried to shield the children from negative media coverage, but in the age of internet and social media, complete protection was nearly impossible. George, at 11, was old enough to seek out information independently, and his serious nature made him particularly attentive to adult concerns. That's true, William replied after a moment's consideration. Some people believe their countries will be better off without any connection to the British monarchy. They have a right to those opinions, and part of our job is to listen to their concerns respectfully. But what if they're mean to you? Lewis asked, his protective instincts emerging despite his young age. What if they say hurtful things? Sometimes people do say hurtful things, Catherine acknowledged. But we try to remember that they usually say them because they care deeply about their countries and their people. They're not necessarily being mean to us personally. This explanation felt inadequate even as she offered it. The reality of Republican protests could be quite personal and sometimes hostile, particularly when directed at the institution of monarchy rather than the individuals who represented it. She and William would need to maintain their composure and dignity in the face of criticism that might be both political and personal. Besides, William added with a slight smile, we've had years of practice dealing with difficult people. Remember Great Uncle Andrew at Christmas dinner last year? This reference to a notoriously cantankerous relative drew giggles from all three children, effectively lightening the mood while acknowledging the reality that not everyone they encountered would be welcoming or kind. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Miss Andrews, the children's governess, whose timing suggested she had been waiting for an appropriate moment to join them. A woman in her 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who had dedicated her career to royal education, she had become an integral part of the family's daily routine. Your Royal Highnesses, she said with a respectful nod. I apologize for interrupting, but we have a mathematics tutorial scheduled for this time, and Professor Williams is waiting in the schoolroom. Catherine felt a familiar pang at this reminder of the structured nature of their children's education. Even their private family conversations were subject to the scheduling demands of tutors, lessons, and official obligations. The children would grow up understanding that spontaneity was a luxury that royal life rarely afforded. Of course, Catherine replied. We can continue this conversation at dinner tonight. The children began gathering themselves for the transition to their afternoon lessons, but Lewis lingered beside the bench, his small hand reaching for Catherine's. Mummy, he said quietly, when you're far away, will you still love us the same amount? The question struck Catherine with unexpected force, revealing the deep insecurities that their departure was creating in her youngest child. She knelt down to bring herself to his eye level, taking his small hands in hers. "Darling," she said firmly, "love doesn't get smaller when people go far away. It stays exactly the same size, no matter how many miles or oceans are between us. Do you know how much I love you? To the moon and back," Lewis recited, repeating the familiar phrase they had shared since he was a toddler. "That's right," Catherine confirmed. "And when we're in Australia or Canada or anywhere else in the world, I'll still love you to the moon and back. The distance won't change that even a tiny bit." George and Charlotte had paused in their departure to listen to this exchange, and Catherine could see in their faces that they had been harboring similar fears. The upcoming separation would be the longest they had ever experienced as a family, and it was natural for the children to worry about whether physical distance might somehow diminish their parents' love and commitment. "Group hug," William announced, opening his arms to encompass all three children in an embrace that temporarily dissolved the formal boundaries of royal protocol. For a moment, they were simply a family dealing with the universal challenge of being apart from loved ones. When the hug ended, the children seemed steadier, their earlier questions answered for now, though Catherine knew more would arise as their departure date approached. Miss Andrews waited patiently for them to complete their emotional business before gently directing them toward their afternoon lessons. As the children walked away across the lawn, Catherine and William remained on the bench, watching their figures grow smaller against the backdrop of the ancient castle that had housed royal families for nearly 1,000 years. The weight of that history felt particularly heavy today, as they contemplated their own small role in the ongoing story of the British monarchy. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" Catherine asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her for weeks. 6 months is such a long time in their lives. George will be almost 12 when we return, practically a teenager. "I think we're making the only choice we can," William replied, his tone carrying the resignation of someone who had learned to accept the constraints of duty. "The Commonwealth relationships need attention, and we're the ones in the best position to provide it. But at what cost?" Catherine pressed, unwilling to let practical considerations override her maternal concerns completely. "What if the children grow more distant from us? What if we miss something crucial in their development?" William was quiet for a moment, considering her concerns with the seriousness they deserved. "My father missed a great deal of my childhood because of his duties," he said finally. "And yes, there were costs to that absence. But there are also benefits to understanding that our family serves something larger than ourselves." Catherine knew he was right in principle, but the practical reality of leaving her children for 6 months felt overwhelming regardless of the noble intentions behind the decision. She had worked hard to be more present in their daily lives than royal tradition typically allowed, attending school events and sports matches, participating in bedtime routines, and homework sessions whenever possible. "The staff has prepared detailed schedules for maintaining contact," William continued, pulling out his phone to show her the carefully coordinated communication plan that their private secretaries had developed. "Video calls every morning and evening, written updates throughout the day, shared photo albums so we could see their daily activities." The technology would help, Catherine knew, but it couldn't replace physical presence during important moments. She would miss reading bedtime stories in person, helping with homework difficulties, providing comfort after nightmares or disappointments. These small daily interactions formed the foundation of parent-child relationships, and she worried about what 6 months of virtual parenting might cost them. "Look," William said, pointing toward the castle where their children had just disappeared through one of the side entrances. "They're stronger than we sometimes give them credit for. They're royal children, which means they've already learned to adapt to situations that would challenge most adults." This was true, Catherine acknowledged. All three children had shown remarkable resilience in dealing with media attention, public scrutiny, and the complex protocols that governed their daily lives. They had learned to switch between public and private personas to maintain appropriate dignity during official events while remaining natural and spontaneous in family settings. "Charlotte asked me yesterday if becoming queen means she'll have to do tours like this too," Catherine said, remembering a conversation that had both amused and sobered her. She wanted to know if there were any alternatives to royal duty, like becoming a scientist or environmental activist instead. "What did you tell her?" William asked, smiling slightly at his daughter's characteristic directness. "I told her that being a royal can include being a scientist or environmental activist, if those are her passions," Catherine replied. "But I also told her that our family has responsibilities to the people we serve, and those responsibilities sometimes require personal sacrifice." The conversation reminded Catherine of similar discussions she had had with William during their courtship, when she was trying to understand what marriage to him would mean for her own dreams and ambitions. She had ultimately decided that loving William and supporting his mission was worth the sacrifices royal life demanded. But she sometimes wondered if their children would make the same choice when their time came. A sharp wind rustled the leaves around them, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the kitchen chimneys and the earthy smell of autumn decay. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal family conversations about duty, sacrifice, and the balance between personal happiness and public service. "We should go in," William said, checking his watch. "I have the security briefing in 20 minutes, and you have the wardrobe consultation with Mrs. Elliot." The practical demands of preparing for a 6-month international tour had consumed much of their time over the past few weeks. Every detail needed to be planned and coordinated, from diplomatic gifts for foreign officials to appropriate clothing for different climates and cultural expectations. Catherine had learned that royal travel required extensive advance preparation, but the scale of the Commonwealth tour had surprised even her experienced staff. As they walked back toward the castle, Catherine thought about the thousands of people who were working to make their tour successful. Embassy staff in dozens of countries were coordinating schedules and security arrangements. Protocol officers were researching cultural sensitivities and diplomatic requirements. Palace staff were preparing wardrobes, gifts, and briefing materials. The tour represented a massive investment of time, money, and human resources, all directed toward maintaining relationships that have been built over centuries. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we just said no?" Catherine asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. "If we decided that 6 months away from our children was too high a price, and refused to go?" William stopped walking and turned to look at her, his expression reflecting both understanding and something that might have been fear. The question touched on the fundamental tension that had existed between the monarchy and individual choice for generations, the ongoing negotiation between personal freedom and inherited responsibility. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted quietly. "But then I remember that saying no isn't really an option for us. Too many people depend on the relationships this tour will maintain and strengthen." Catherine nodded, accepting the truth of his statement while still feeling the rebellion of her maternal instincts against the demands of royal duty. They had chosen this life, or rather William had been born to it, and she had chosen to join him, but their children had inherited these obligations without any choice in the matter. "After this tour," she said, "after we've fulfilled these obligations and strengthened these relationships, I want us to commit to being more present for the children's daily lives. 6 months apart should be the exception, not the beginning of a pattern." "Agreed," William said immediately, his relief evident. "This tour will position us well for years to come. If we do it right, we won't need another extended separation like this for a long time." As they entered the castle through the garden entrance, Catherine felt a mixture of resignation and determination settling over her. The next few months would test their family in ways they had never experienced, but they would face those challenges together even when they were apart. The love that had sustained them through 15 years of marriage and 11 years of parenting would have to be strong enough to bridge whatever distances the Commonwealth tour created. The castle walls seemed to embrace them as they walked through familiar corridors toward their respective afternoon obligations, and Catherine drew comfort from the continuity these ancient stones represented. Countless royal families had faced similar challenges over the centuries, had found ways to balance personal desires with public duty, had maintained love and connection across distances and difficulties. Tonight at dinner, they would continue their conversation with the children, answering more questions and providing more reassurance about the months ahead. Tomorrow, the practical preparations would continue with fittings and briefings and coordination meetings. But for now, in this moment of transition between private reflection and public responsibility, Catherine allowed herself to hold on to the hope that their family would emerge from this separation stronger and more appreciative of the time they had together. The morning of their departure arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt almost like a blessing from the English countryside they were leaving behind. Catherine stood at the window of their bedroom, watching the early mist rise from the lawns of Windsor Castle as the sun painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. In just 3 hours, they would board the royal aircraft for the first leg of their journey to Australia, beginning a separation from their children that would stretch across 6 months and half the globe. The children were still asleep in their rooms down the corridor, having been allowed to stay up late the previous evening for a family dinner that had stretched well past their usual bedtime. They had made pancakes together in the small kitchen attached to their private quarters, a tradition that Catherine had established years ago as a way to maintain normal family moments within the artificial constraints of royal life. George had attempted to flip his pancake with dramatic flair and had ended up with batter on the ceiling, much to Louis's delight and Charlotte's amused exasperation. "The cars will be here in 2 hours," William said from the doorway, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he adopted when discussing logistical arrangements that carried heavy emotional weight. He was already dressed in the navy suit he would wear for their departure photos, his appearance reflecting the formal dignity expected of someone embarking on such an important diplomatic mission. Catherine nodded without turning from the window. She had been dressed for over an hour, having found herself unable to sleep during the final hours before their departure. The pale blue dress she had chosen was both elegant and practical for travel, designed to photograph while remaining comfortable during the long flight ahead. Her stylist had selected it specifically for the departure images that would appear in newspapers around the world, the first visual representation of a tour that would be scrutinized by millions of people across dozens of countries. "Are the briefing materials loaded on the plane?" Catherine asked, though she knew William's private secretary would have confirmed this detail multiple times. The question was more about maintaining the illusion of control over circumstances that felt increasingly overwhelming than about gathering necessary information. "Everything is prepared," William assured her. "James has the complete files, Mrs. Patterson has confirmed all the protocol requirements, and the embassy staff in Canberra have been briefed on our arrival preferences." The mechanical precision of their departure preparations stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos Catherine felt building in her chest. Over the past week, she had checked and rechecked every arrangement for the children's care during their absence, had written detailed letters for them to open on difficult days, had recorded bedtime stories on her tablet for nights when video calls might not be possible due to time zone differences. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Catherine called, expecting to see one of their staff members with a final update or question. Instead, George appeared in the doorway, still wearing his pajamas but clearly awake and alert despite the early hour. His sandy hair was rumpled from sleep, but his expression carried the serious determination that Catherine had begun to associate with moments when he was processing complex emotions. "I couldn't sleep," he said simply, approaching his parents with a direct honesty that characterized his communication style. "I kept thinking about things I forgot to tell you before you leave." Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack at the sight of her eldest son's vulnerable expression. She knelt down to bring herself to his eye level. Opening her arms for the hug she could see he needed but was too dignified to request explicitly. "What things, darling?" she asked as he settled into her embrace, his 11-year-old frame feeling both substantial and fragile against her shoulder. "I wanted to tell you they'll take good care of Charlotte and Louis while you're gone," George said, his voice muffled against her dress. I know I'm not an adult, but I'm the oldest, so I should help them if they get sad or worried. The weight of responsibility he was placing on his own small shoulders made Catherine's heart ache. George had always been mature for his age, but the approaching separation was clearly pushing him toward an even more adult perspective on family obligations. She wondered if this was how William had felt at George's age, already understanding that his birth order carried expectations and duties that his younger brother Harry would never fully share. "You're a wonderful big brother," Catherine said carefully, "but taking care of Charlotte and Louis isn't your job. The adults around you will handle any problems or sadness. Your job is to be 11 years old and focus on your schoolwork and friends and the things you enjoy." George pulled back slightly to look at her face, his blue eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far older than his years. "But what if they ask me questions I don't know how to answer? What if they want to know why you had to go away for so long, or when exactly you're coming back?" These questions revealed the depth of George's own confusion and concern about the tour. Despite their careful explanations about duty and service and the importance of Commonwealth relationships, he was still a child trying to make sense of why his parents had chosen to leave him for such an extended period. "You can always tell them to ask Granny or Papa Charles or Miss Andrews," William said, settling onto the edge of the bed so he could join their conversation. "And you can always call us if there's something you need to discuss. We're never too far away to help with important decisions." "Will you be sad sometimes?" George asked suddenly, directing the question to both parents with the perceptive directness that often surprised adults. Miss Andrews said it's normal for parents to miss their children when they travel, but she didn't know if you would be too busy with important work to feel sad. Catherine exchanged a glance with William, recognizing that their son was offering them permission to acknowledge their own emotional struggles with the separation. They had been so focused on reassuring the children that they would be well cared for and that the tour was necessary and important that they hadn't acknowledged their own sadness about leaving. "We'll be very sad sometimes," Catherine admitted honestly. "There will be moments when we'll want nothing more than to come home and have dinner with you and help you with homework and read bedtime stories. But we'll also be doing work that we believe is important and that will help us feel proud and purposeful even when we're missing you." George seemed satisfied with this answer, apparently having needed confirmation that their departure represented a genuine sacrifice rather than a choice they were making lightly. His understanding of adult emotions continued to surprise Catherine, who sometimes forgot how carefully children observed and interpreted the behavior of the grown-ups around them. "I made you something," George said, producing a folded piece of paper from his pajama pocket. "It's not very good, but I wanted you to have it for the plane." Catherine unfolded the paper to reveal a drawing that depicted their family standing in front of Windsor Castle, with lines connecting each figure to the others in an intricate web of relationships. At the bottom, George had written, "Love stays strong, even far away," in his careful 11-year-old handwriting. "This is beautiful," Catherine said, meaning it completely despite the simple nature of the artwork. "We'll keep it with us throughout the entire tour, and whenever we're feeling far from home, we'll look at it and remember that we're still connected to you." George smiled at her response, the tension leaving his shoulders now that he had completed this important pre-departure mission. "I should go back to bed," he said, though his tone suggested he was no more likely to fall asleep now than he had been earlier. "Try to rest a little longer," William suggested gently. "We'll wake you before we leave for the airport, and we'll have breakfast together." After George left their room, Catherine and William sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the emotional weight of their son's visit. The drawing he had created lay on the bed between them, its simple lines capturing something essential about family connections that all their careful planning and preparation had somehow missed. "He's worried about being the one in charge," Catherine said finally. "He thinks that being the oldest means he's responsible for his siblings' emotional well-being while we're away." "I felt the same way at his age," William admitted. "After my mother died, I thought it was my job to protect Harry from sadness and confusion. It's a heavy burden for a child to carry." Catherine folded George's drawing carefully and placed it in her travel purse, where it would indeed accompany them throughout their tour. The gesture felt symbolic of the challenge they faced in maintaining family connections across vast distances and busy schedules. Physical reminders like the drawing would help, but they couldn't replace the daily interactions that formed the foundation of parent-child relationships. A gentle commotion from the corridor suggested that Charlotte and Louis had awakened and were probably seeking their parents before the departure preparations began in earnest. Catherine felt a familiar tightening in her chest at the thought of the formal goodbye they would soon be required to perform for the cameras, knowing that their private family farewell would be much more difficult than any public ceremony. "Your Royal Highnesses?" came the familiar voice of Miss Andrews from the hallway, followed by a soft knock. "The children are awake and asking if they might join you for morning tea before breakfast." Morning tea had become another family tradition, a brief gathering over simple refreshments that allowed them to connect before the day's official obligations separated them into their individual schedules. Catherine treasured these informal moments, knowing that they represented the kind of normal family experience that would become impossible once their royal duties took them abroad. "Of course," Catherine called. "Please bring them in, and perhaps arrange for some biscuits and fruit to be sent up from the kitchen." Within minutes, their bedroom had been transformed into an impromptu family gathering space, with Charlotte and Louis curled up on a large armchair by the window, while George settled cross-legged on the Persian carpet. Miss Andrews had efficiently arranged a tea service on the small table near the fireplace, creating a cozy domestic scene that felt remarkably normal despite the impending departure. "I had a dream about kangaroos last night," Louis announced with the matter-of-fact tone he used for all his observations, whether they concerned dreams, playground discoveries, or complex family dynamics. They were wearing little crowns and speaking with British accents. This image drew laughter from everyone in the room, providing a moment of lightness that felt especially precious given the emotional weight of the morning. Louis had a gift for these unexpected pronouncements that could shift the mood of any gathering, a quality that Catherine hoped would serve him well in royal life if he chose to embrace those responsibilities. "You might see real kangaroos while we're in Australia," William told him, "though probably without crowns or British accents. We're visiting several wildlife preserves where kangaroos live in their natural habitats. Will you take pictures?" Charlotte asked with the practical focus she brought to most conversations. "I want to see everything you see, especially the animals and plants that are different from England." Catherine had already planned to document their tour extensively, both for official purposes and for sharing with the children. The royal photographers would capture formal events and public appearances, but she intended to take personal photos and videos that would help her children feel connected to their parents' experiences. "We'll take hundreds of pictures," Catherine promised, "and we'll send them to you every day so you can follow our journey and see all the amazing places we visit." Miss Andrews said, "We're going to study the Commonwealth countries while you're traveling," George added, "so we can understand the places you're visiting and the people you're meeting." This educational approach had been one of Miss Andrews' suggestions for helping the children feel more connected to their parents' mission. By learning about Australia's geography, New Zealand's Maori culture, Canada's French heritage, and the unique characteristics of each nation they would visit, the children could follow the tour with genuine understanding rather than simply marking days on a calendar. "That's a wonderful idea," William said. "When we return, we can compare what you learned from your studies with what we experienced firsthand." The conversation was interrupted by another knock, this time from James Harrison, William's private secretary, whose apologetic expression suggested he was reluctant to intrude on family time, but had important information to share. "Forgive the interruption," James said after being invited into the room. "The airport has confirmed our departure slot, and the advance team in Canberra has reported favorable weather conditions. The Prime Minister's office has also requested a brief call before takeoff to discuss some last-minute protocol adjustments." Catherine felt the familiar sensation of their private family world beginning to dissolve as official responsibilities reasserted themselves. Within an hour, They would be surrounded by staff, photographers, and the elaborate machinery of royal travel. This quiet morning gathering would become a memory to sustain them during the busy months ahead. "How long until the cars arrive?" William asked, though Catherine could see that he already knew the answer and was asking more for the children's benefit than his own. 90 minutes, sir," James replied, "which allows time for breakfast and the family photographs that have been requested by the Palace Communications Office." The mention of official photographs reminded Catherine that even their departure would become part of the public record of this tour. Images of their final family moments at Windsor would appear in newspapers and websites around the world, analyzed and interpreted by commentators who would speculate about their emotions and motivations. "We should begin getting ready," Catherine said, though she felt no urgency about the practical preparations that awaited them. The luggage had been packed for days, the travel documents were in order, and the staff had confirmed every detail multiple times. What she really needed to prepare for was the emotional challenge of saying goodbye to her children in front of cameras while maintaining the composed dignity expected of someone in her position. "Can we have breakfast in the garden?" Lewis asked suddenly, his request reflecting a 6-year-old's instinct for creating special moments. "It's such a beautiful morning, and we won't be able to have breakfast together outside for a long time." Catherine looked at William, who nodded immediately despite the logistical complications this request would create for their staff. Maintaining flexibility for family preferences had become one of their shared priorities, a small rebellion against the rigid scheduling that dominated most aspects of royal life. "I'll arrange for breakfast to be served on the Rose Terrace," Miss Andrews offered, already moving toward the door to coordinate with the kitchen staff. "The weather is indeed lovely, and it would provide a beautiful setting for the family photographs as well." As their children dispersed to get dressed for breakfast and the formal departure ceremony, Catherine and William found themselves alone again in their bedroom. The morning light had grown stronger, streaming through the windows in golden bands that highlighted the dust motes dancing in the warm air. In a few hours, they would be breathing airplane air over the Atlantic, beginning a journey that would take them further from home than they had ever traveled together. "Are you ready for this?" William asked, though Catherine suspected he was really asking whether she thought they were making the right choice. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I don't think we'll ever feel completely ready to leave them for 6 months. If we wait until we're ready, we'll never go." William nodded, accepting the wisdom of her observation. Royal duty rarely aligned with personal readiness or emotional comfort. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years partly because successive generations had been willing to make personal sacrifices for institutional continuity and public service. After breakfast, Catherine said, "After the photographs and the goodbyes and all the ceremony, I want 5 minutes alone with each of them. No cameras, no staff, just private time to say the things that matter most." "Of course," William agreed immediately. James can adjust the schedule to accommodate that. Some moments should remain private, regardless of public interest or media expectations. As they prepared to join their children for what would be their last family breakfast for many months, Catherine reflected on the strange duality of royal life that made even the most intimate family moments subject to public scrutiny and official scheduling. But within those constraints, they had learned to create genuine connection and authentic love, to raise children who understood both their privileges and their responsibilities. The drawing George had given her rested safely in her purse, a tangible reminder that love could indeed stay strong across any distance. In the months ahead, she would need to hold on to that truth through time zones and state dinners, through official obligations and private loneliness, through all the challenges that awaited them in the Commonwealth countries they were preparing to serve. But for now, on this golden October morning at Windsor Castle, they still had time for breakfast in the garden and private conversations and the ordinary magic of being a family together in the place they called home.